Do you remember when the kitchen taught you more than any book ever could? When bacon fat had a purpose and even old bread got a second chance? These weren't just cooking tricks. They were how we got by. They helped meals stretch, made simple food taste better, and brought comfort on hard days. So, when did we stop sharing them? Bacon grease jar. Every kitchen had one. A dented tin or repurposed jelly jar parked right beside the hottest burner. After breakfast, you'd wait a moment for the bacon fat to stop sizzling, then pour that warm amber liquid straight in. No funnel, no measuring, just a steady hand and a promise to use every drop. When it cooled, it sat solid and pale, like butter that carried the smoke of yesterday's skillet. You'd grip a butter knife or the edge of a spoon and scoop it out, listening to that soft pop as it broke free. A spoonful in the pan for Sunday beans, a swirl in cornbread batter, a slick under morning eggs. Sometimes folks strained it through cheesecloth. Most didn't fuss over it. A little grit only made it feel honest. This wasn't fancy cooking. It was common sense. Meat was pricey. Butter ran out fast. But bacon grease? It was free flavor, tucked in plain sight. It stretched meals, made boiled potatoes taste like a treat, turned limp greens into comfort. And you never learned it from a book. You watched your mother scoop and stir, and one day your hand did the same. Today, people toss grease down the drain. But back then, that little jar held the heartbeat of home. Water glassing eggs. In winter, you'd open the pantry and find a big glass jar, cloudy with lime and water, cradling eggs like pale lanterns. No labels, no dates, just a quiet promise that spring wasn't gone forever. You used fresh eggs, straight from the hen, never washed, so the natural bloom stayed intact. Into the lime water they went, pointy end down, one by one. If a shell cracked, you fished it out, no compromises. Then the jar was tucked into the coolest corner, root cellar, back porch, even under the stairs. Weeks turned into months, and when the hens stopped laying, you cracked one over a hot skillet, half expecting disaster. But there it was, a bright yolk, firm white, ready for pancakes or custard as if it had just been laid. Sure, a few jars went off now and then, but you learned to sniff and inspect before you used them. No refrigeration, no expiration stickers, just old-time know-how. Today, an egg's shelf life is stamped on cardboard, and anything past date goes in the trash. But back then, that cloudy jar was winter's lifeline, whispered down through generations and never let you down. Stale bread pudding revival. You've seen that loaf at the back of the counter, hard as a rock and begging to be tossed. But instead, you wrap it in a damp towel, tuck it into a warm oven, and 10 minutes later, it's like waking a ghost back to life. The crust softens, the crumb steams, and suddenly yesterday's sandwich bread smells of fresh bakery. You don't need a recipe. Tear that loaf into chunks, toss in a buttered baking dish, pour over a mix of milk, eggs, a pinch of sugar and spice, cinnamon or nutmeg, whatever's on the shelf, and let it soak. It's messy. Some pieces float, some sink. That's fine. The edges turn golden crisp while the center stays custardy. When it comes out, the whole kitchen fills with warm sweetness. You snag a spoonful, comfort in a scoop. Maybe you drizzle molasses or a dab of jam on top. Maybe you eat it straight from the pan, napkin in hand. No need for fancy toppings. This was born of necessity, turning possible waste into breakfast, dessert, or a late-night snack that feels like a hug. Fruit leather from scraps. You've pulped strawberries to a sauce, zested oranges for tea, and squeezed every drop of juice. What's left? The skins and cores. Instead of tossing them, you blitz those bits into a rough puree. Sweeten with a spoonful of honey or sugar, and whisk in lemon juice. Spread it thin on a greased baking sheet or parchment. Set the oven to its lowest setting, and leave the door cracked. Hours later, that sloppy mess transforms into a leathery sheet you peel off like vintage wallpaper. Fold it, slice it into strips, and pack it in jars or wax paper. It's tangy, chewy, a little sticky, and every bite is a surprise of flavor you almost wasted. Kids love the texture. You'll nibble a corner when no one's looking. Some folks sun-dried theirs on racks. Others used a dehydrator if they had one. A few batches bubbled and bubbled before they finally set. Imperfect, but edible. That's the point. Making the most of what you had. No factory flavors, no preservatives, just kitchen scraps turned into snackable gold, rendering lard at home. On a cool afternoon, you'd see a heavy pot on the back burner, filled with chunky bits of pork fat, just waiting. No hurry, just a low, steady simmer that sent gentle bubbles rising like tiny memories. You stirred it occasionally with a wooden spoon, watching as the white chunks melted into clear golden liquid. When it stopped popping, you leaned in and took a whiff of that warm, almost sweet smell, nothing like store-bought shortening. You'd scoop the cracklings out with a slotted spoon, snack for later, then pour the liquid through a coarse cloth or fine sieve into crocks or old coffee cans. Some folks skipped the straining and let the small bits settle at the bottom. It didn't hurt a thing. As it cooled, the lard turned creamy white and firm, ready for pie crusts that flaked on your tongue or chicken fried to a perfect crisp. You'd pat it into zip-top bags or jars, tuck it in the pantry, and trust it to be there next winter. It was work, sure, but it was also pride. Every biscuit you rolled out, every gravy you thickened, carried that slow-cooked love. No additives, no mystery oils, just pure homemade lard that tasted like home. Drippings for gravy. After the roast came out of the oven, there was always a moment of hush around that pan. You tilted it slightly, careful not to spill a drop, and used a fork or spatula to scrape up the dark, caramelized bits stuck to the bottom. Into a fat separator went that glossy liquid, meat juices and melted fat swirling together. You poured the thin layer of juice into a hot skillet, left the fat behind, then stirred in a spoonful of flour. It hissed as it cooked, turning sandy and nutty, a slow stream of stock, chicken, beef, or leftover pan juices, whisked in until the lumps smoothed out. You could hear it thicken, bubbling softly, the aroma filling the kitchen with memories of Sunday dinners. Some days you added a splash of cream or a sprinkle of chopped herbs. Other days you kept it simple. You ladled the gravy over mashed potatoes, biscuits, even meatloaf, and watched plates wipe clean. A few folks let the dripping sit too long and got a greasy sheen on top. No big deal, you just scooped it off. Imperfect, yes, but richer for it. This wasn't boxed mix. It was the real thing, made from whatever roasted, simmered, and stuck to the pan. And that little jar of drippings in the fridge? It was your secret to turning any meal into a feast. Rendering chicken fat, schmaltz. On any given Sunday, you'd see a bowl of chicken skins and fat trimmings waiting by the sink, pale, rubbery bits that looked like scraps but were worth their weight in gold. You'd chop them roughly, toss them into a cold pan, and set it over the lowest flame. No rush. Just a gentle melt, fat oozing out as the skins crackled softly. You'd lean close and breathe it in, rich, slightly sweet, with a hint of roasting yet to come. As the fat pooled, you scooped out the cracklings with a slotted spoon, crispy morsels saved for later. The liquid fat you poured through a fine mesh strainer or cheesecloth into a glass jar, watching it glisten in the afternoon light. Some folks skipped straining and accepted a few specks. It didn't change the taste. Once cool, it behaved like butter, opaque and firm, but its flavor was pure poultry. You rubbed it into matzo ball dough, used it to saute onions for chicken soup, or spread it on toast with a sprinkle of salt. A spoonful in a skillet turned duck fat, dreams pale by comparison. It was thrift and luxury all at once, born of necessity in kitchens where nothing was wasted. You never forgot the first time you tasted schmaltz on mashed potatoes. Comfort you could chew, and because you made it yourself, you trusted it more than any store-bought shortening. Clarifying butter for storage. You'd cut a stick of butter into cubes, cold from the fridge, and melt it slowly in a small saucepan. As it softened, pale foam rose to the top like gentle waves. You'd skim that off with a spoon, revealing a clear golden pool below. No hurry, just a steady skim until the milk solids sank and the liquid shone. Then, with a practiced hand, you poured that liquid through cheesecloth into a jar, leaving behind any cloudy bits. It glittered in the afternoon sun, looking almost like honey. You sealed it tight and tucked it into a cool pantry or refrigerator, knowing it would keep weeks longer than whole butter. When you needed it, you scooped out that clear, rich fat. No hiss, no sputter, just smooth, pure butter flavor. You used it to sear fish, finish sauces, or brush on hot biscuits, confident it wouldn't burn or brown too quickly. And because the milk solids were gone, it didn't spoil fast. On cold mornings, you'd watch it set firm, ready for whatever the day demanded. This wasn't a chef's trick. It was home cook wisdom. It stretched butter, cut down waste, and made every dish taste a little cleaner, a little brighter. And once you tasted the difference in your gravy or your green beans, there was no going back. Homemade rendered suet. You'd watch your grandmother hack off chunks of suet, the hard fat from around the kidneys, into small cubes, each no bigger than a sugar cube. Those pale squares went into a heavy pot over the lowest flame, and you stirred with a wooden spoon until they began to soften. As the sweat slowly melted, you heard gentle crackles and watched clear fat pool at the bottom, leaving behind browned bits you knew would be snackable later. Once the bubbling stopped, you scooped out the cracklings with a slotted spoon and tasted one. Rich, crispy morsels studded with a hint of meatiness. Then came the pour. Hot, liquid fat slipped through a fine mesh sieve into crocks or repurposed coffee cans. Some folks filtered through cheesecloth. Others let the bits settle out on their own. The jar cooled to a firm, creamy block, its surface unbroken until you tapped it with a knife and heard that satisfying snap. This wasn't just about making pudding or dumplings. Rendered sweat was your shortcut to flaky pie crusts that shattered on your tongue, to traditional plum pudding that steamed with richness, to suet cakes for winter birds. It stretched every pound of meat, turned scraps into pantry staples, and carried the warmth of hearth cooking through the coldest months. No store-bought shortening could match its flavor or its history. Today, most cooks reach for vegetable shortening. But back then, a jar of homemade suet fat on the shelf meant self-reliance, an inheritance of taste that no label could replicate. Fat washing for flavor. You've seen recipes that call for a twist. Infuse spirits or oils with the taste of bacon, duck fat, or even miso-infused grease. That's fat washing, an old kitchen secret made modern. You start by melting a few tablespoons of flavorful fat, say crisped bacon drippings, then mixing it into a cup of whiskey or gin. You swirl it gently, letting the warm fat dissolve. Then let it rest until the fat cools and rises to the surface. As it chills, the fat hardens into a thin layer on top. You lean in, spoon it off, and strain the liquid through a coffee filter or fine cloth. What's left is a spirit carrying that smoky, savory edge without a greasy mouthfeel. Some bartenders skip the filter and cloud the drink for that rustic look. Most strain until crystal clear. You taste a sip, smooth, with a whisper of bacon fat that lingers just long enough to surprise you. Fat washing isn't just for cocktails. You can infuse oils for popcorn, whisk miso butter into mashed potatoes, or stir duck fat into melted chocolate for an umami kicker. It's a messy process. Little flecks of solid fat cling to the bowl. You end up wiping spoons and sometimes the filter clogs, but that's part of the charm. It's insider knowledge, the kind you learn from a friend leaning in to whisper, "Trust me, try this." In kitchens, where every scrap mattered, fat washing turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. It was creative thrift, using what you had to make flavors pop. And once you taste that first savory Manhattan or umami-touched caramel, you understand why nobody ever forgot the trick. Buttermilk, from soured milk. You peeked into the glass jug on the counter and saw that faint ring of film at the top, sign that the milk had gone off. Instead of tossing it, you grabbed a tablespoon of white vinegar, or lemon juice if that's what was handy, and stirred it right in. No fancy measuring, just enough to watch the milk swirl and curdle into little white clouds. You set it aside for 5 minutes, and while you washed your mixing bowl, you could hear the milk settle, thickening, turning slightly lumpy, but not in a bad way. When you came back, it looked like buttermilk, pale, tangy, and ready for action. You dipped a finger in and tasted that sharp tang, the promise of fluffier pancakes or biscuits that would rise taller than you thought possible. Some recipes called for a full cup, others only needed a quarter. You poured it into batter for cornbread one day, and the next morning you ladled it into pancake mix, bubbles popping on the griddle like tiny bells. Sure, store-bought buttermilk was smoother, but this had character, little bits of curd that gave texture to your scones, richness to gravy, and a gentle sour note that made everything sing. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the flavor was stronger than you expected. Sometimes the curds floated into your batter. But you learned to skim them, to whisk a little longer, to lean into the tang. That soured milk jug? It became a hero of breakfast and baking, a small trick that saved a gallon of milk and made every bite taste like thrift and know-how. Croutons from stale bread. That loaf lying around, too hard for sandwiches but too good to waste, became your secret weapon. You chopped it into rough cubes, tossed them in a bowl with a drizzle of oil and a pinch of salt, and gave it a good shake. Some folks added garlic powder or dried herbs. Others kept it plain. Either way, the kitchen smelled like promise before the oven even clicked on. As the cubes roasted, you listened for the gentle tink of bread against pan and the soft hiss as oil met hot metal. You turned them once, flipped with a spatula, so every side kissed the heat. 15 minutes later, they emerged golden brown, edges crisp, centers still just soft enough to sink your teeth into. You'd let them cool on a rack, then stash them in a jar or tin. Some days you sprinkled Parmesan over them. Other days you dropped them straight into salad or soup, crunch echoing in the bowl. A spoonful of tomato soup never felt complete without that snap of crouton under your spoon. And on lazy afternoons, you'd nibble a few straight from the jar, tiny comfort bites. It wasn't glamorous. The cubes were uneven, some too crunchy, some too doughy, but every piece carried that little kick of olive oil and the smoky edge of the oven. It was a way to honor that stale loaf, stretch a meal, and sneak in flavor where none existed before. In a world of store-bought mixes and prepackaged snacks, these croutons felt like a handshake from your grandmother's kitchen, simple, sensible, and surprisingly delicious. Potato water in bread dough. Next time you boil potatoes, don't drain off that starchy water. Save it. You know the pale, cloudy liquid left in the pot? That's gold for bread. Instead of plain tap, you pour that warm potato water into your flour, yeast, salt, and a drizzle of oil. No fancy measuring, just enough to form a tacky, springy dough. You knead it by hand, feeling the dough soften under your palms, a bit silkier than usual. The starch pumps in moisture, so the crust crisps up thin and crackly, while the crumb stays pillowy and light, even after a day or two. Some folks swear by using the water hot. Others let it cool first. Either way, it gives your loaf a gentle sweetness and keeps slices from drying out. It's a bit messy. You'll see flecks of potato peel or little bits of skin, and that's fine. It reminds you someone's been in the kitchen. You watch the dough rise in that same bowl, cover it with a tea towel, and by evening you've got bread that pulls apart soft as a pillow. Guests ask what's different, and you just wink. Oh, nothing special. Just a secret from old kitchens. This trick stretches your bake, adds depth without extra ingredients, and makes day-old bread taste fresh. And best of all, it costs nothing but the potatoes you've already cooked. Never fail pie crust with lard. If you want a crust that never shrinks, cracks, or turns tough, lard is your best friend. You toss flour, a pinch of salt, and cubed ice-cold lard into a bowl, then rub with fingertips until the mixture looks like coarse cornmeal with little white pebbles, each one a promise of flake. No electric gadgets, just your hands, flour dust on the counter, and that satisfying scrunch. Some folks add a splash of vinegar or a tablespoon of sugar for extra tenderness. Others stick to the basics. You drizzle in just enough iced water, finger chilled, to bring the dough together. Press it once into a disc, tuck it into the fridge for at least 30 minutes, and let the fat firm up. That rest time, it's crucial. It stops gluten from overworking and keeps the crust from pulling back when you bake. When you roll it out, floured board, gentle turns, the edges hold their shape. Into the pan it goes, cold and confident. Dock it with a fork, blind bake with pie weights or dried beans if the recipe calls for it, and watch the edges brown evenly. No soggy bottom, no gap between crust and filling, just a golden, tender shell that snaps when you cut it. This isn't a fancy chef's secret. It's real-world wisdom. Lard makes pastry reliable, buttery in taste, and sturdy enough for any filling. Once you taste it, apple, pumpkin, or chicken pot pie, you'll ditch the butter and never look back. Making your own baking powder. You'd pull out your cupboard and find two familiar jars, one labeled baking soda, the other cream of tartar. No box of commercial baking powder sat there. Instead, you measured and mixed right when you needed it. It wasn't about extra work. It was about freshness and knowing exactly what went into your cakes, biscuits, and muffins. When a recipe called for baking powder, you'd grab a small bowl, scoop in 2 parts cream of tartar to 1 part baking soda, no more than a teaspoon at a time, and whisk them together until they looked pale and powdery. Sometimes you added a pinch of cornstarch if your pantry was humid, just to keep the mix from clumping. Other days, you skipped the cornstarch and trusted that you would use it up quickly enough. Either way, you ended up with a leavening agent that puffed your dough higher and tasted cleaner than anything off a shelf. You learned this trick because the boxed stuff sometimes sat too long under bright grocery lights. By the time you got home, it might have lost its fizz. But when you mixed it by hand, you mixed only what you needed. You could hear it fizz the moment it hit the wet batter, tiny bubbles dancing in the spoon before it ever saw the oven heat. That fizz was promise. Light, tender crumb. No strange aftertaste, just pure rising power. It wasn't always precise. On busy mornings, you might eyeball the ratios, 2 scoops cream of tartar, 1 scoop baking soda, and hope for the best. A few muffins came out a tad denser if you mismeasured, but nothing ruined. You adjusted the next time. That was part of the rhythm. Mix, bake, taste, tweak. With this homemade baking powder, your biscuits rose taller, your cakes stayed moist longer, and you never worried about stale cans losing their spark. It was a small ritual, 5 minutes before oven time, but it made every bite taste like wisdom handed down. And in kitchens where every ingredient mattered, that little bowl of fizz became as essential as the flour itself. Pot roast from lesser cuts. You'd wander past the butcher counter and spot the cheaper cuts. Chuck roast, blade, brisket, those marbled hunks that looked tough but promised deep flavor if you knew what you were doing. Someone taught you that skill. Heat, time, and patience could turn that cheap meat into fork-tender perfection. First, you patted the roast dry with paper towels and seasoned it generously. Salt, pepper, maybe a pinch of paprika or a crushed garlic clove pressed into the surface. You heated a heavy pot, cast iron Dutch oven preferred, until it was almost smoking, then added a little oil. You laid the roast in, hearing it sizzle as the meat met the metal. You let it sear without moving, turning it once or twice until all sides were deep mahogany brown, rich with caramelized juices. Next came the vegetables, rough chopped onions, carrots snapped at the ends, celery sticks left in big pieces, even a few peeled potatoes tossed in. You stirred in a spoonful of tomato paste, letting it cook away its raw edge, then poured in enough stock, beef, chicken broth, or even watered down wine, to come halfway up the roast. A sprig of thyme, a bay leaf, maybe a smashed clove of garlic went in too. Then you covered the pot tightly, shoved it into a low oven, around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and walked away. Hours later, 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours, you returned to find the house filled with savory steam. You lifted the lid and saw bubbling liquid scalding on the edges, vegetables collapsing into the gravy, and that chuck roast, once rigid and chewy looking, now shrunk slightly and falling apart at a light nudge of your fork. You scooped the meat onto a plate, shredded it with 2 forks, and spooned the fragrant juice over the top. A tangle of carrots and potatoes nestled beside the beef, soaking up every drop of the rich sauce. It wasn't fancy. The meat looked pedestrian before cooking. The pot was messy, splattered sides, bits stuck to the bottom, but you ladled it onto dinner plates, and the way that roast melted on your tongue, the way the gravy clung to every crevice of the meat and veggies, that's how you turned cheap cuts into a feast. And when someone asked for seconds, you just smiled and said, "Secrets in the low and slow, salt curing meats." Small scale. You'd see the salt box on the counter, coarse, almost sandy to the touch, and know a cure was coming. In a cool corner of the kitchen, you mixed salt, sugar, a handful of cracked peppercorns, and sometimes crushed juniper berries or bay leaves. Everything coarse enough to rub in by hand. No fancy cure kits, just pantry staples and a sense of purpose. First, you trimmed a pork loin or a slab of beef brisket, patted it dry, and laid it on a wooden board. Then came the ritual. You scooped handfuls of the coarse mixture and pressed firmly into every nook, edges, crevices, even into small cuts you sometimes made to help the cure seep deeper. You worked the meat like dough, massaging it until every inch was coated in that gritty paste. It felt strange under your fingers, cool and damp, grainy yet yielding. Once coated, you packed the meat into a shallow glass dish, covered it, and tucked it into the coldest part of the fridge or root cellar. Every day, or every other day, depending on the size, you'd flip the piece and scrape off the juices that pooled beneath, then reapply fresh cure. A bit messy, sure. Salt crystals clung to counters. The dish sometimes bubbled with liquid that smelled sharp and almost sweet, but you learned to trust the routine. After 7, 10, or even 14 days, you'd unwrap that cured piece, now firm, tinged pink from the salt's pull, the surface slightly tacky. You rinsed it under cool water, patted it dry, and hung it to air dry for a few hours. Sometimes you'd leave it hanging by a string near a sunny window or a cool pantry shelf. The aroma was unmistakable, a sharp tang of preserved meat, a whisper of pepper, the faint undercurrent of sweet sugar. When sliced thin, it tasted complex. Salt forward, yes, but balanced by that sugar kiss and pepper bite. You dropped slices into soups, layered them on sandwiches, or crisped them in a skillet for breakfast. No synthetic nitrates, no mystery ingredients, just salt, time, and patience. It wasn't fast food, it was legacy food, a way to honor every cut, stretch your provisions, and carry centuries-old craftsmanship into your own kitchen. And every bite reminded you that real flavor often comes from the most hands-on, grainy, slow processes imaginable. Soup bones for broth. Before you ever touched a seasoning jar, you grabbed those scrap bins or freezer bags labeled soup bones. Ribs, knuckles, marrow-filled joints, even leftover carcasses. You'd see them collected week after week, each bone a promise of something richer than any store-bought stock. Into a large pot they went, a pile of bones, a roughly chopped onion or two, skins on for color, carrot ends, celery leaf trimmings, a couple of garlic cloves with skin, a handful of whole peppercorns, and a bay leaf or two. You filled it with cold water until everything was submerged, then set it over low heat. No rushing, just a slow bring to barely there bubbles. As it simmered, a gray scum crawled up, and you skimmed it away with a ladle, watching the broth clear again. The kitchen filled with a low, homey rumble, bones clinking, veggies softening. You'd lean over, inhale that deep, savory scent, and feel something settle in your chest. If you had time, you turned the heat almost off after the initial boil and let it steep all afternoon, or even overnight on the back burner. Some days you added a splash of vinegar, apple cider or plain white, to coax minerals out of the marrow. Other days you skipped it, trusting the bones to impart enough depth on their own. After 3, 4, sometimes 8 hours, you turned off the pot and let it rest. Then came the messy part. You poured the liquid through a colander, then a fine mesh sieve, sometimes even cheesecloth if you wanted crystal clear broth. The color was honey gold, with a sheen of fat on top that you gently poured off once it cooled, saving it for frying onions or greasing pans. What remained was liquid warmth, broth so full-bodied that a spoon stood up in it for a moment. You used it in soups, stews, gravies, even mashed potatoes, each dish singing with layers of bone-bred richness. It wasn't quick. It left a pot to clean and a few stray bits to fish out later. But this was real stock. No powders, no MSG, just the marrow, the collagen, the marrow's creamy whisper, and vegetables rendered gentle by time. In every simmer, you tasted history. The way kitchens once sustained families, turned scraps into nourishment, and taught you that good things come to those who wait. Corncob smoked meats. You'd finish shucking the last ears of summer corn and pile the cobs beside the woodpile, knowing you weren't tossing them out. Later that afternoon, you'd gather those dried cobs, bundle them in twine, and lay them around your meat, pork shoulders, chicken quarters, or strips of bacon, inside a makeshift smoker. No hickory chips, no fancy equipment, just corn cobs, a few coals, and patient heat. Once the fire caught, you'd watch pale tendrils of smoke rise scented with faint sweetness. The corn cobs crackled as they burned, burning slower than wood, giving a steady, gentle smoke that carried deep into the meat. You leaned in close, inhaling that soft graham-like aroma mingled with raw pork or poultry. As the hours ticked by, the smoke stained the meat pink around the edges and seeped in, layer by layer, until every bite held a whisper of summer's last harvest. It wasn't fast. You kept the temperature low, around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, tending embers, rearranging cobs to keep smoke even. Sometimes you dampened a handful of cobs to slow the burn. Other times you let them blaze a little harder, depending on the cut. You flipped the meat once, wiping off drips and rebunching the cobs. It was messy. Ash fell, cob dust shifted, and your hands smelled like a cornhusker's glove. But by sundown, the meat was glossy, firm, and fragrant. When you sliced into that first piece, the smell filled the yard. Sweet, earthy, smoky. The texture was tender, but with a slight chew, as though the smoke and meat had become one. You ate it straight or chopped it for beans, even turned it into sandwiches on homemade bread. Every forkful spoke of ingenuity, turning a byproduct of the garden into the heart of the meal. Today, most smokers use pellets or chips in metal boxes. But back then, those humble cobs were free, abundant, and perfect for slow smoke. They carried the taste of field and harvest right into your winter pantry. Hardtack for emergencies. On a day when flour ran low and payday still felt weeks away, you mixed equal parts flour and water, nothing more. No yeast, no salt, just a stiff, dusty dough that you rolled out thin, pricked all over with a fork, and baked slowly until it hardened into pale biscuits. They looked like flimsy tiles, smooth, flat, and as brittle as old parchment. You'd bake them twice, once to set the shape, again to drive out every last bit of moisture. The kitchen smelled of warm flour and dry heat. Some folks sprinkled a little salt. Others left them plain. A few brave bakers topped the dough with seeds or peppercorns for flavor, but most stuck to the basics. When they came out, you broke off a corner. It snapped clean, leaving a thin, sturdy shard. These weren't snacks. They were survival food. You'd pack them in canvas sacks alongside jerky and dried fruit, knowing they'd last months. unmoved by humidity or critters. When you needed them, you cracked one into crumbs, stirred them into soups or stews to thicken, or soaked them in water or broth until they softened into bland but sustaining bites. Sailors and soldiers blamed hardtack for cranky stomachs, but they respected its reliability. At home, you kept a stack in a tin in the pantry. During storms or late winter snows, when fresh bread felt impossible, you reached for hardtack. You dunked it in coffee or tea, letting it soften just enough to chew. It wasn't delicious, but it filled you. You learned to appreciate its simplicity. Just flour, water, thyme, and the oven's low heat. No preservatives, no mystery shelf lives. Just a recipe as old as necessity itself, written in the corners of hushed kitchens and passed down by folks who knew that in a pinch a bite of hardtack might keep hunger at bay